CD 2. Chapter 6. V Aurora. We followed Toby through the suburbs for several miles, and the sun was coming up when the dog finally stopped beside the River Thames. Here he stood, looking at the water as it moved quickly towards the sea. "What luck," said Holmes. "They've taken a boat." "Perhaps they used one of these," I suggested, pointing at the 6 or 7 boats that we could see on the river. "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "Let's see what Toby thinks." We took the dog to each of the boats, one after the other, but he showed no interest in any of them. There was a small house beside the river, and outside it there was a sign with these words on it: "Mordecai Smith, Boats for Hire, Steam Launch." My friend looked worried when he saw this. "They're cleverer than I thought, Watson," he said. Just then the door of the house opened. A young boy ran out. His mother, a large woman with a red face, followed him. "Come back!" she cried. "I'll wash your face this morning if it's the last thing that I do." "Hello," said Holmes to the boy. "You're a fine young man. Is there anything you'd like?" The child looked up at my friend in surprise.
"I'd like a shilling," he said. "Please."
"Of course," Holmes agreed, taking a shilling from his pocket. "You have a good boy here, Mrs. Smith." The woman stopped to look at my friend as he spoke.
"He is a good boy," she replied. "Usually, but he can be very difficult when my husband's away."
"Is Mr. Smith away at the moment?" asked Holmes. "I was hoping to speak to him."
"He went away yesterday morning," she replied, "and I'm quite worried about him, sir. He took the steam launch and he only had enough coal to travel a very short way. But he's been away for more than 24 hours now."
"Could he buy more coal along the river?" Holmes suggested.
"I don't think so," said Mrs. Smith. "And I don't like the man who went with him. He's been here before. He's got a wooden leg. This time he came in the middle of the night, and I haven't seen my husband since then."
"Are you sure it was the man with the wooden leg?" asked Holmes. "You didn't see him, I suppose?"
"No, I didn't. But I know it was him," the woman replied. "I heard his wooden leg on the street when he walked away with my husband and my older boy, Jim."
"Well," said Holmes, "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Smith. I very much wanted to hire your steam launch. So many people have told me that she's a good boat."
"Yes,"
Mrs. Smith agreed.
"The Aurora's a fine launch."
"The Aurora," said Holmes. "Green, isn't she? And quite wide?"
"Oh, no, sir," the woman replied. "The Aurora isn't wide, and she's black, not green."
"Of course," Holmes agreed. "Black, not green. We must go, Mrs. Smith. I hope that you will have news of your husband soon. If I see him along the river, I'll tell him that you're worried. Goodbye." My friend and I then found a man with a boat who took us across the river. When we reached the other side, Holmes turned to me. "Well, Watson," he asked, "what should we do now?" "I think we should hire another launch and go after the Aurora," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "There are too many places along the river for the Aurora to hide," he said. "We might spend days looking for her." "Then perhaps we should ask Inspector Lestrade for some help from Scotland Yard," I replied. "Not yet, Watson," said my friend. "I'd like to find Mr. Jonathan Small for myself, if I can. No, let's take this cab here back to Baker Street and have some breakfast. We should also sleep for an hour or two." We got into the cab and were soon travelling north to Baker Street with the dog, Toby. On the way, Holmes asked the driver to stop at a post office. There he got down from the cab, and when he came back, he told me that he had sent a telegram.
"Do you remember the group of street boys who helped us once before, Watson?" he asked. "I've sent a telegram to their leader. I'm sure he and the boys will be with us before we've finished breakfast."
It was after 8 o'clock when we arrived at 221B Baker Street. I was exhausted and went to have a bath. After this, and an excellent breakfast of coffee, toast and eggs, I felt better. Holmes drank only a cup of coffee and smoked a cigarette before showing me the morning newspaper.
"Look at this, Watson," he smiled. "Inspector Lestrade has been speaking to the reporters, I think."
I took the newspaper from my friend and read the story. Strange business in Norwood. At about midnight last night, Mr. Bartholomew Sholto of Pondicherry Lodge, Norwood, was found dead in his room. The police think that he was murdered. We understand that some valuable treasure was stolen from the house. Mr. Sholto's father, an army officer, had brought the treasure back from India. Mr. Sholto's body was found by Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the detective, and his associate, Dr. John Watson. They had come to Pondicherry Lodge with the dead man's brother, Mr. Thaddeus Sholto. By chance, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was at the police station in Norwood, and he immediately went to the house. The inspector quickly realized that someone had committed a serious crime and arrested Mr. Thaddeus Sholto and 3 servants from the house. He saw that the murderer had entered the dead man's room from a secret space under the roof, and not by the door or window, and understood that the murderer must be someone who knew Pondicherry Lodge very well. This newspaper feels that the people of London should again be grateful to Inspector Lestrade for his excellent work in arresting criminals so quickly. I put down the newspaper. "But this is stupid, Holmes," I said.
"Of course," my friend agreed, "but it makes me smile."
Just then we heard lots of high voices at our door. Chapter 7. The Baker Street Boys. "Who's making that terrible noise?" I asked in surprise. Holmes put out his cigarette.
"The Baker Street Boys, if I'm not wrong," he answered calmly.
Mrs. Hudson came in with a cross look on her face.
"The Baker Street Boys for you, Mr. Holmes," she said.
10 boys, most in dirty clothes and all without shoes, came into the room. They stood in a line and looked at my friend and myself. Their leader, who was taller and older than the others, stepped forward.
"I got your message, sir," he said to Holmes, "and we came as quickly as we could." "Thank you, Wiggins," Holmes replied. "Now listen carefully, all of you. I want you to find a black steam launch called the Aurora. Her owner is Mr. Mordecai Smith. She's somewhere on the river, but we have no idea where. One boy needs to wait by Smith's house at Millbank, because the launch may come back. The rest of you should search both banks of the river and tell me as soon as you have news. Is that clear?"
"Yes, sir,"
said Wiggins.
"I'll pay the same as before," said Holmes, "with £1 more for the boy who finds the boat. Here's your money for today."
He gave each boy a coin, and they ran down the stairs at once and disappeared into Baker Street.
"If the launch is on the river, they'll find her," said Holmes, standing up and lighting another cigarette. "Those boys can go everywhere, see everything, listen to everyone.
I'm sure one of them will find the Aurora today. So we must wait, Watson, because without Mr. Mordecai Smith or his launch, there's nothing we can do." "Are you going to bed, Holmes?" I asked. My friend shook his head. "I'm not tired, Watson. Work never makes me tired, but I always become exhausted when I have nothing to do. I'm going to smoke another cigarette or two and think about all this. Let's not forget that we're looking for a man with a wooden leg and his very strange associate. It really shouldn't be too difficult to find them." "Who is this associate, Holmes?" I wondered. "There's no great mystery there," Holmes replied. "I don't know the man's name, of course, but I know a lot about him. He has very small feet and no spaces between his toes. He doesn't wear shoes and he climbs very well. He kills with poisoned thorns. The natives of the Andaman Islands are the smallest people in the world. And I understand that they are also very ugly, with large heads and tiny hands and feet. They often kill strangers who come to their islands, and they're cannibals too." "Friendly people, then," I said. "As I said, Watson, Jonathan Small's associate is a very dangerous person." Suddenly, my friend looked worried. "But you look exhausted, Watson. Why don't you sleep?" "I am tired," I agreed. "Perhaps I will rest for a while." As I fell asleep in my chair, Sherlock Holmes was standing at the window looking down into Baker Street, playing his violin. I dreamed, of course, of Miss Mary Morstan. I slept until the afternoon and woke up like a new man. Holmes was sitting at the table, reading a book. "You slept very deeply, Watson," he said. "I feared that our conversation would wake you up." "Has Wiggins come back, then?" I asked. "I heard nothing." "He's just left," Holmes replied. "But he had no news for us. His boys have found nothing. I must say that I'm surprised and disappointed. Time is short." "Can I do anything?" I offered. "I'm quite ready for another adventure after my sleep." "No, we can do nothing," said Holmes. "We can only wait. If we go out, Wiggins may return to find nobody here, and there must be no unnecessary delay. You can do what you wish, Watson, but I must stay here." "Then I'll go to Camberwell," I replied. "Miss Morstan asked me to give her any news of our adventures, and although there's nothing we can do at the moment, I can tell her about Small and his associate, and about the Aurora." "Don't stay too long, Watson," said my friend. "We may have work to do later. Oh, and can you take Toby back on your way to Camberwell? His work for us is finished." I took the dog to the strange house where I had found him and paid his owner. Then I went on to Camberwell. Miss Morstan was quite tired after her adventures the night before, but she was very interested in my story. "If we find the treasure," I said, "you'll be very rich, Mary." I was pleased to see she didn't seem thrilled by the idea. "I'm thinking more about Mr. Thaddeus," she replied. "He's a good man. We must do everything that we can to help him." Her words only made me love her more. I stayed in Camberwell talking for several hours, and it was dark when I returned to Baker Street. My friend's book was on the table with his cigarette box, but Holmes himself had gone. "Has Mr. Holmes gone out?" I asked Mrs. Hudson. "No, sir. He's gone to his bedroom." Suddenly she spoke very quietly. "I'm worried about him, sir. After you left, he walked and walked around this room for hours. Then I heard him muttering to himself in a strange way. Every time someone knocked on the front door, he came to the top of the stairs and called down to me, 'What's that, Mrs. Hudson?' And now he's gone up to his room, but I can still hear him up there walking around. I hope that he isn't sick, sir." "I don't think that you need to worry too much, Mrs. Hudson," I replied. "I've seen this before. He's thinking, that's all." "I hope that you're right, sir," she said. Chapter 8. The Old Sailor. During the long night that followed, I heard my friend walking around his bedroom, and at breakfast the next morning I could see that he had not slept at all. "Are you all right, Holmes?" I asked. "I heard you moving around your room in the night."
"I didn't sleep," my friend replied. "I spent the night thinking about our problem. I know the men. I know the launch. Everything. But I can get no news. The Baker Street boys have searched both sides of the river, but they found nothing. And Mrs. Smith has no news of her husband. It's a real mystery."
"Is it possible that the launch is no longer in the centre of London, but has travelled up the river?" I wondered.
"I had the same idea," said Holmes. "Some of the boys are now searching both banks of the river as far up as Richmond. If they find anything, Wiggins will come and tell us."
But the day passed, and we did not see Wiggins. Holmes and I read the newspapers, which contained more stories about the death in Norwood. They all reported that Thaddeus Sholto was the probable murderer of his brother Bartholomew, and described Inspector Lestrade as a great detective. In the evening, I took a cab to Camberwell to give the latest news to Miss Morstan. When I returned to Baker Street, my friend was strangely silent. He answered my questions with single words, and smoked cigarette after cigarette. I woke early to find him by my bed, dressed as a sailor.
"I'm going down the river, Watson," he said. "I've been thinking about this all night, and it's the only thing to do."
"I'll come with you," I offered immediately.
"No," he replied. "You must stay here. We may have news from young Wiggins during the day. Please open any messages or telegrams that arrive and decide what to do if news comes. Will you do that for me, Watson?"
"Of course," I agreed.
"You can't send me a telegram," he said, "because I don't know where I'll be. But I hope that I won't be away long, and I'm sure I'll have some news when I come back."
I got up hours later. Mrs. Hudson brought me the morning newspaper with my breakfast. On the second page I read, "Strange Death in Norwood. The mystery around the death of Mr. Bartholomew Sholto in Norwood, South London, has become deeper. It is now clear that Mr. Sholto was not murdered by his brother Thaddeus, who is now a free man. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has told this newspaper that he hopes to arrest the real killer in the very near future." Laughing, I threw the paper onto the table, but then saw a small notice at the bottom of the page. I read it interestedly. "Lost. Mordecai Smith, boatman, and his son Jim left their house by the river at Millbank, London, in the steam launch Aurora at 3 o'clock last Tuesday morning. Since then, there has been no news of them. Mrs. Smith at Millbank, or at 221B Baker Street, will pay £5 to anyone who can give her information about her husband and his launch." That notice is Holmes's idea, I thought. It was a very long day. I spent it waiting for a knock at the door with news of Mordecai Smith and the Aurora. I tried to read my book, but found it impossible not to think about Miss Morstan and the missing treasure. At 3 o'clock, I finally heard a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson brought Inspector Lestrade into the room.
"Is Mr. Holmes out, sir?"
he asked. "He is," I said. "Please sit down, Inspector. Can I offer you a glass of whisky?"
"That's very kind, Dr. Watson,"
he said, sitting down in an armchair. "Just a small one, with lots of water.
It's a very hot day, and this murder in Norwood is a real mystery.
So, Mr. Thaddeus isn't his brother's murderer, then? I said, bringing Lestrade his drink.
That's right, Lestrade agreed. After he left Mr. Bartholomew on the night of his death, he was with someone all the time. He can't be the murderer.
The inspector looked so disappointed I didn't like to remind him about Holmes saying Thaddeus Sholto was not his man.
Your friend Mr. Holmes is a wonderful man, he said suddenly. He's clever, and he never gives up. He's difficult sometimes, it's true, and he works in strange ways, but he's helped the police several times, and I'm grateful to him for that.
What brings you here, Inspector? I asked, smiling. Lestrade took a paper from his pocket.
I've received a telegram from Mr. Holmes, he replied.
I took the telegram from the inspector and read it quickly. To Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Go to Baker Street immediately. If I am not there, wait for me with Dr. Watson. We hope to find Sholto's killer tonight. Holmes. This is good news, I said.
Of course, it isn't certain that Mr. Holmes will take us to the murderer, said Lestrade, who had now finished his whisky.
His words made me angry, but before I could say anything, we heard someone coming up the stairs very slowly, breathing heavily. An old, white-haired sailor opened the door.
Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?
He asked in a dry voice. No, I replied, but I work with Mr. Holmes, so if you have a message for him, you can give it to me. The old sailor stopped to think for a moment.
I have to report my news to Mr. Holmes himself, he said.
Is it about Mordecai Smith's launch, the Aurora?
Yes, I know where the men are, and that treasure too.
Then tell me, I said, and I'll tell Sherlock Holmes when he returns.
No, the man replied. I'll only talk to Mr. Holmes himself.
Well, you must wait for him then, I said.
I'm a busy man, he answered. I can't wait for anyone.
He turned to leave the room, but Lestrade had stood up and was now at the door.
That's not possible, I'm afraid, he said. You have important information and must stay here. Please, sit down.
It's not fair,
said the old sailor with an angry look on his face, but he sat down in an armchair. Lestrade and I sat down at the table. I offered him a cigar, and we continued our conversation. Suddenly, we both heard Holmes's voice in the room with us.
Aren't you going to offer me a cigar too?
We turned in surprise to see Holmes in the armchair where the old sailor had been sitting. "Holmes!" I cried. "But where's the sailor?"
"Here,"
he said, and he pointed to a white wig on the table next to him.
"I'm your sailor. I'm very pleased you and the inspector didn't recognize me. I've spent the day as an old man, and a very interesting day, too. I understand Mr. Thaddeus Sholto and his servants are no longer under arrest."
Lestrade nodded sadly.
"Don't worry, Inspector," Holmes went on. "We'll soon have the real criminals. I need a fast police boat, a steam launch, at Westminster at 7 o'clock this evening."
Lestrade agreed immediately.
"I'll also need 2 strong police officers, because there will be 2 or 3 men on the Aurora."
Lestrade nodded.
"And finally, I'm sure that when we find the treasure, Dr. Watson would like to take it to Miss Morstan, the owner."
Lestrade looked a little worried for a moment.
"All right," he said, "but the police need to see it later."
"Of course," Holmes agreed. "I think we'll have an interesting evening, gentlemen."
Lestrade ate dinner with us. Holmes was now very bright and excited, while Lestrade seemed calmer. When Mrs. Hudson had taken the plates away after our meal, Holmes gave a glass of whisky to Lestrade and another to me.
"A drink before we go," he said.
Watson, please bring your revolver with you. Our adventures tonight may be dangerous. He looked out of the window. Our cab's here, he went on. Let's go. We reached Westminster just after 7 o'clock. Our boat was waiting for us. Lestrade, Holmes and I boarded the launch and sat down at the back. There was a crew of 2 men, and there were also 2 tall police officers on the boat.
"Where are we going?"
asked Lestrade. To the Tower of London, Holmes replied. Our launch moved quickly away from the riverbank. Good, said Holmes. Our boat is a fast one. Watson, let me explain why we're here. The Baker Street boys couldn't find the Aurora anywhere on the river, but I knew the boat must be somewhere. Small and his associate were hiding, I was sure, until the time was right for them to leave the country. Suddenly, I realized what they'd done. They'd left the Aurora with a boat builder and had probably asked him to do some small repairs. Dressed as an old sailor, I visited every boat builder on the river. I had no luck at the first 15 builders, but at the 16th, I found the Aurora and Mr. Mordecai Smith himself. He was very drunk and was shouting at the boat builder. I want her tonight at 8 o'clock and not a moment later. I have 2 gentlemen who won't wait. Smith went back to the pub, and I returned to Baker Street. We'll wait on the river for the Aurora to appear, and when she does, we'll take Small, his associate, and the treasure.
"The plan might work, I suppose," said Lestrade.
We'll see, Inspector, said Holmes, smiling. Chapter 9. Adventure on the River. The sun was going down when we reached the boat builder's place near the Tower of London. That's where the Aurora's hidden, said Holmes, pointing across the river. We'll wait here until we see her. We all watched carefully, and at 8 o'clock, as Holmes had told us, the launch appeared. The Aurora was moving very quickly through the water. There she is, cried Holmes. Let's go, as fast as we can. Our launch was soon travelling quickly down the river after the Aurora. The crew put more coal onto the fire to make her move as fast as possible. We raced past all kinds of boats and heard voices shouting at us as we passed. The Aurora went faster, and we followed her closely.
"We'll soon catch her,"
said Lestrade. But just then, another launch suddenly moved across the river in front of us, and we had to stop. When we started again, the Aurora was more than 200 yards away. We were now far down the river. The sky was full of stars, so we could see the Aurora clearly in front of us. Lestrade turned our searchlight on her, and we immediately saw the people on board. One man sat at the back of the launch, with something that looked like a large dog at his feet. Next to him stood a boy. Mordecai Smith was busy throwing coal onto the fire as fast as he could. The only thing we could hear now in the silence of the night was the sound of the Aurora as the launch moved quickly down the river.
"Stop!"
shouted Lestrade. We were very close, and both launches were travelling at top speed. At Lestrade's shout, the man at the back of the Aurora stood up and shouted angrily back at us. He was tall and looked very strong, but I could see immediately that he had a wooden leg. As he stood up, I realized that the figure at his feet was not in fact a dog, but a tiny, dark-skinned man with an enormous head and long, dirty hair. He had the ugliest face that I've ever seen, and the look in his eyes was terrible. Holmes immediately took out his revolver, and I did the same.
"Shoot if he lifts his hand, Watson," said my friend quietly.
We were only a few yards behind the Aurora now. Suddenly, the black man pulled a short, round piece of wood from his pocket and put it to his lips. Holmes and I fired our revolvers at the same time, and he fell back into the river. I saw his terrible eyes for a short moment before his head disappeared into the black water of the Thames. Next, the man with the wooden leg steered the launch to the riverbank. We followed at top speed, but we were not quick enough to stop him jumping from the Aurora. Luckily for us, he didn't manage to move very far. At that place on the river, the banks were very muddy, and it wasn't long before the man's wooden leg was deep in the mud. He pulled and pulled, but he couldn't move. It was only with the help of a rope that we were able to pull him on board our launch. The man was furious, but there was nothing that he could do. Lestrade ordered Mordecai Smith and the boy to board our launch, and, although they looked very unhappy, they didn't try to escape. On the deck of the Aurora, we could see a large Indian chest, and we knew at once that it contained, or had contained, the Sholto family's treasure. There was no key, but Lestrade's men moved the heavy chest from the Aurora onto the police launch. It was terrible to think how many men had lost their lives for that treasure. We tied the Aurora to the back of our launch and moved slowly back up the river. Lestrade shone the searchlight onto the water, but Small's companion had disappeared. We sat opposite the man with the wooden leg. His skin was dark from the sun, and I could see that he'd spent much of his life outdoors. He looked more sad now than angry.
"Well, Jonathan Small," said Holmes, lighting a cigarette, "can you tell us why you had to kill Mr. Bartholomew Sholto?"
Small looked at us miserably.
"Tonga killed him,"
he said,
"with one of his poison thorns. I was very angry with him, but it was too late. Sholto was already dead when I climbed through the window."
Holmes offered him a cigarette and some whiskey, which he accepted gratefully. The drink made him speak more freely.
"It was a terrible surprise," he went on, "seeing him dead with that awful smile on him. That wasn't part of my plan."
At that moment, Lestrade joined us.
"Mr. Mordecai Smith tells me he didn't know anything about the Norwood murder."
"It's true,"
Small agreed.
"I paid him well, but I never told him anything about that."
"Then we won't arrest him for the moment," said Lestrade.
The launch stopped at Vauxhall Bridge for me to take the treasure to Miss Morstan, as we'd agreed. Lestrade wanted to open the chest and examine it, but Small explained that he'd thrown the key into the Thames. I travelled to Camberwell by cab with Sergeant Judd, who helped me to carry the chest to Miss Morstan's door. She was surprised to see me arrive so late in the evening, but she let me into the house immediately. "I've brought you the treasure," I said, with a heavy heart. We sat down in the living room.
"Please tell me how you found it,"
she replied. She seemed interested, but not thrilled that the treasure chest was hers at last. I told her the story of our adventures, to which she listened very carefully.
"It's a beautiful chest," she said when I had finished. "Indian, I suppose. Where's the key?"
"In the Thames," I answered. "I'll have to break it open." It took some time, but we finally managed to open the chest. To our great surprise, it was empty.
"So the treasure is lost," said Miss Morstan calmly.
I saw immediately that this fact did not trouble her. "Thank God!" I cried. She looked at me with a strange smile.
"Why do you say that?"
she asked. "Because I love you, Mary," I replied. "And now that there is no treasure between us, I can tell you." She looked into my eyes, and I knew then that we would be happy forever. Chapter 10. The Sign of 4. I returned to Baker Street with Sergeant Judd. Holmes had just arrived with Lestrade and Jonathan Small because they had visited Scotland Yard on their way. I showed them the empty chest. Holmes laughed, but Lestrade was furious.
"What have you done with the treasure, Small?" he cried.
Jonathan Small stared back at him. "I've hidden it in a place where you'll never find it," he replied. "That treasure belongs to me and 3 men who are still in prison in the Andaman Islands, the Sign of 4. That's why I threw it into the Thames, so that no one in the Sholto or Morstan family would have it. You'll find the treasure in the same place that you'll find little Tonga and the key."
"Why didn't you throw the chest into the river? Why did you take the treasure out?"
asked the inspector. Small looked very pleased with himself. "Because I knew it would be much easier to find one chest at the bottom of the Thames than all the pieces of treasure in 100 different places," he replied.
"That was a very stupid thing to do, Small," Lestrade told him. "You haven't helped yourself."
Small was now very angry. "The treasure belongs to me and the others," he repeated. "Not to any Sholto or Morstan. You have no idea of the price we paid to get that treasure, or the pain."
"You're right," Holmes said as he lit a cigarette. "We haven't heard your story, so we don't know how you acquired the treasure. Please tell us."
Small became a little calmer at Holmes's words.
"You've been fair to me, sir," he said.
"So if you want to hear my story, I'll tell you. But there's a lot to tell. Perhaps I could have a drink?" Lestrade nodded, and Holmes gave Small a small glass of whisky. He took a drink and began his story. "I was born in the west of England, and my family were good, honest people. I always brought them a lot of trouble. When I was 18, I joined the army and went to India. But I hadn't been there very long when I went swimming in the river Ganges. I was attacked by a crocodile and it bit my leg off. I almost died. I spent 5 months in hospital, and when I came out, the army didn't want me anymore. I was miserable for a while, but then a man called Abel White gave me work. It was a good job, and I decided to spend the rest of my life working for him when suddenly the country was at war. One minute everything was calm, and the next minute 200,000 natives were attacking all the white men in India. Night after night the sky was lit by burning houses on the hilltops. It was a terrible time. Every day we saw white men and their families on their way to Agra, where the nearest soldiers were. But Mr. White refused to leave, and I stayed with him, until the day that the natives came for him. They burned his house and murdered him. I found his body, half-eaten by wild dogs. Of course, I ran for my life. Late one night I managed to reach Agra, but the rebels were everywhere. I joined the soldiers who were trying to defend the city, but it was impossible. Finally, we had to hide in the old fort of Agra. It's an enormous place, and we didn't have enough men to defend all the gates. So we had a group in the middle of the fort, and one white man with 2 or 3 natives at each gate. There were 2 Sikhs with me as their leader at one gate. We'd spent 2 nights together. They were both tall, strong men, Mohammed Singh and Abdullah Khan. They could speak English quite well, but they didn't say much. I stood alone at the gate,
looking down on the river and the great city. We heard the rebels all night and could never forget the danger we were in. The third night was dark and dirty, with heavy rain. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I put down my gun to light a cigarette, and immediately the Sikhs attacked me. They had knives, and I was too terrified to move. "Don't make a noise," said Karn. "If you work with us tonight, you'll receive a quarter of some treasure that we're planning to steal. It will be divided between the 4 of us." "Who is the 4th person?" I asked. "Dost Akbar," he replied. "Now, if you're with us, I will explain." I nodded to show that I agreed. There is a man in the north of the country who's very rich, although he doesn't have much land. When the trouble in the country started, he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't lose all his treasure. So he packed half of it in a chest and sent it here with one of his servants. This man is disguised as a merchant, and he uses the name Ahmed. He's now in the city of Agra, waiting to enter the fort. He has a companion, Dost Akbar, my cousin, who knows his secret. Dost Akbar will lead him to this gate tonight, and when he arrives, Mohammed Singh and I will kill him. The treasure will be ours. Now, will you help us? Here in London, a man's life seems important, but in India at that time we saw death everywhere. I didn't know Ahmed, but I could see immediately how the treasure would change my life. I agreed to help. It was still raining and there were heavy brown clouds in the sky. Less than an hour after my conversation with Khan, Ahmed arrived at the gate with Dost Akbar. Dost Akbar was an enormous Sikh with a long black beard, and Ahmed was a small, fat, frightened man. "Please help us," he said. "We've travelled a long way and need a safe place to spend the night." I didn't want to speak to the man for long because I knew he was going to die. "Enter," I said. "These men will show you the way." The 2 Sikhs took him away, but 2 minutes later, Ahmed came running towards me with Dost Akbar close behind. The Sikh was holding an enormous knife. I could see that the little merchant was going to escape, so I threw myself in front of him. He fell, and almost immediately he was dead. Dost Akbar had plunged the knife into his heart. What we did that night was wrong, I know, but you must understand that I had no choice. I had to help them. "Please, continue," said Holmes impatiently. Small went on with his story. "We dug a hole and buried the merchant. Then we opened the chest. There were jewels of every kind, hundreds of them inside. They would be divided among the 4 of us. But for now, we had to hide them. We buried the treasure near the merchant's body, and I drew 4 maps and put the sign of the 4 of us on each one. We knew then that we would always be true to each other. Well, I suppose that you gentlemen know what happened next. More British soldiers arrived in the country and drove the rebels back. Agra was taken by the British Army, and we were beginning to hope that we would be able to leave with our treasure. But then we were arrested for the murder of Ahmed. We were all found guilty and sent to prison for life, although nobody knew anything about the treasure. We were sent at first to prison in Madras, but later we were moved to the Andaman Islands. I was the only white prisoner there, so I didn't have a bad life. In the evenings, I was even allowed to watch the army officers, Major Sholto and Captain Morstan, play cards with some of the prison officers. I noticed that the army officers always lost, and one night Major Sholto lost a lot of money. I heard him tell Captain Morstan that he was in serious financial trouble and would have to leave the army, and I saw my chance to escape. I told the Major about the jewels and suggested that he and Captain Morstan should have a fifth of the treasure if they would help the four escape. We agreed on a plan, and I gave a map to Sholto and another to Morstan to show where the treasure was hidden. You can probably guess the rest of the story. Sholto tricked us all and returned to England with the treasure. I was furious, but there was nothing that I could do until several years later when I saved the life of a native, Tonga, and he helped me to escape from the Andaman Islands. We came to England together and, if I'm not wrong, you know the rest, Mr. Holmes. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lestrade spoke.
Well, Mr. Holmes, you've done well here, he said. And now I must arrest you, Jonathan Small. Sergeant Judd is waiting downstairs with a cab.
Small seemed strangely calm as he was taken away. Holmes and I sat at the table and lit cigarettes. Holmes, I said heavily, the adventure of the Agra treasure may be our last together.
Really?
I've asked Miss Morstan to marry me, I went on, and I'm happy to say that she's accepted.
Yes,
Holmes replied calmly.
I know.
Impossible, I cried. We've told nobody.
Elementary, said Holmes. Let me explain.